The spring morning of 1887 carried the harsh wind of Wyoming across endless plains, sweeping dust and cattle cries into that dry chorus. The land seemed to hum without rest. On the northern ridge, Jonah Hale sat on horseback like a weathered bronze statue, his frame so steady it looked as if even the wind had learned to go around him. At 45, he had lived more than half his life with soil, rain, and fire. His dark hair was streaked with silver, his hands hardened like rawhide, and his eyes held the stillness of a man who had lost too much to fear anything anymore. Since his wife's death from fever 2 winters ago, Jonah had not strayed more than a mile from his ranch. Folks said he was a man of discipline, up before sunrise, working until dusk, eating in silence, sleeping as if it were a duty. He didn't talk much, and when he did, his voice carried the weary tenderness of someone who once knew love but forgot how to show it. That morning, as the herd of 2,000 pushed down into the valley, something strange stirred in his chest. A weight first, then a sharp twist. He hit it well, shouting orders to the young cowhands, his voice rough and commanding. All his life, Jonah believed the body was just a tool. So long as it obeyed, he'd keep going. But when he reached for his canteen, his fingers suddenly felt foreign, disconnected. The chill spread from wrist to elbow, and then his chest tightened. The sky above was cruelly blue, the horizon beginning to tilt. Hoofbeats faded somewhere far off, mingling with the heavy breath of the earth. Jonah tried to hold steady, but his body pitched forward. The last thing he saw before the world dimmed was a cloud of gold dust rising from the ground, and then everything dissolved into a dizzy blur. When he woke, the first sound he heard was the tapping of a pen on wood. Not horses, not wind. The smell of alcohol and herbs filled his nose. He was lying in the dim light of a small clinic in Laramie. Beside him sat Dr. Harrison, an aging man with bottle-thick glasses, looking at Jonah as one might look at a mountain about to crumble. "Your heart," Harrison said plainly, "is worn thin, like a saddle that's been ridden too long without rest." Jonah stared at the ceiling. The cracks in the plaster spread like a map of uncharted country. His voice came out rough. "How long?" "A year, if you stop working. 3 months if you don't." The words dropped like stones. Jonah didn't flinch. He had buried a wife, seen storms tear down a whole season's hay, watched cattle freeze white in winter drifts. Death wasn't a stranger to him. Yet lying there, listening to the tick of the clock, he found himself afraid. Not of dying, but of leaving nothing behind that mattered. Outside the window, wind carried faint bells from a passing wagon train. He turned his head and saw through the glass the dusty main street of Laramie. Young men laughing, life beginning again, while his own seemed to be counting backward. Harrison left the room, setting a folded prescription on the table. Jonah didn't read it. He only listened to the heavy rhythm inside his chest. Slow, stubborn, still fighting. He closed his eyes, and in that silence, a thought crossed his mind, like a shadow over open grassland. Maybe death isn't what he feared most. Maybe it was being forgotten. Outside, the sun climbed slow and steady. Its light slipped through the curtain, resting on the weathered face of Jonah Hale, the man who once believed he could never fall, now facing the hardest lesson of all, how to live slowly. And he didn't yet know that within days, fate would send him someone, a young black woman with eyes that held both defiance and mercy, to remind his heart of what it had forgotten, how to beat for someone else. The Maverick Hotel sat on the corner of Frontier Street, where Wyoming dust never seemed to settle. At noon, sunlight poured through fogged window panes, cutting across wooden tables darkened by years of sweat and time. Inside the small dining room, Nadine Cross moved between tables with a tray in her hands. Steady, graceful, every motion precise. She was 21. People said she was striking, though not in the way that made men stop and stare. Her skin was smooth, a warm bronze glow, her hair tied low at the nape, revealing a long, proud neck, and her eyes, large, dark, clear like rainwater, had a way of making people uneasy, as if they reflected more than they should. Her hands were rough, her nails short, small knife scars along her fingers from years of labor. Yet there was something in her face that made it hard for anyone to speak harshly to her. A quiet resilience, the kind that's been tested too often to break anymore. That noon, Jonah Hale walked in. He still carried the look of a man who'd once commanded a trail crew, broad-shouldered, upright, with eyes the color of cold ash, though weariness lingered beneath. His shirt was buttoned high, gloves looped at his belt, his steps slow but certain. The room fell half-silent when he entered. Everyone knew Jonah Hale, knew the vast spread he owned, knew the talk of his illness, but no one dared mention it. He took a seat in the far corner, facing the street. When Nadine approached, she gave a small nod, her voice soft as breath. "What will you have today, sir?" "Anything that doesn't take much chewing," he said, a faint smile tracing his lips like a fading ink line. She jotted it down and slipped into the kitchen. A few minutes later, she returned with a steaming bowl of stew, a slice of bread, and a pot of strong coffee. Jonah looked up as she set the plate down. Beads of sweat glistened at her neck in the sunlight. The scent of meat and herbs mingled with soap and warm skin, a mix that made him feel, unexpectedly, alive. Then it happened, in the span of a single breath. As she turned to pour his coffee, the hem of her dress caught on a chair leg. The tray tipped, the bowl lurched, and the stew spilled straight into his lap. The sound was thick and wet. The smell of cooked carrots filled the air. The whole room froze. Nadine stood motionless, eyes wide, face drained of color. A heartbeat later, she stammered, "Oh, Lord, I'm so sorry." She couldn't finish. All her life, she'd known what a mistake like this could cost. For a black woman, one slip was enough to lose everything. In a land like this, mercy was rarer than rain. Jonah looked down at the sauce staining his shirt. Then, he laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not a tired one, but deep and rough. The laugh of a man surprised to find the world still capable of startling him. Every gaze turned toward him. Nadine froze, not understanding. Jonah pulled off his napkin, wiped it down, the mess, and said slowly, his voice low and even, "Guess I just learned not everything that falls on a man is a disaster." She blinked, unsure whether to cry or smile. "I'll pay for the shirt," she said quickly, "or clean it. I can—" Now, he interrupted gently. "Spilling stew on me isn't a hanging offense. Besides, I've been cold all morning. Now I'm warm." A few men chuckled. The tension broke. Nadine bent to mop the spilled coffee, her hands trembling slightly, the scent of soap and sweat rising again. When she lifted her head, their eyes met. Just a moment, but Jonah felt something shift inside him, like a window opening in a long-sealed house. In those eyes, he saw not fear alone, but the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to stand tall in a world that kept trying to bend her. When Jonah left the hotel, the stain on his shirt had dried dark, and the smell of stew lingered faintly. He stepped into the wind, And for the first time in months, the ache in his chest wasn't from illness. It was from something else entirely. As the sound of horses drifted from the street, Jonah Hale thought to himself, maybe I'm not dead inside after all. Since the day of the spilled stew, Jonah Hale had become a regular at the Maverick Hotel's dining room. No one said it out loud, but everyone noticed he always came at the same hour, always sat at the same table. At first, Nadine thought it was coincidence. But as the days passed, and she saw him sitting in the corner where the late sun slanted through the window and painted a soft streak across his weathered face, she began to understand. He came for something more than a meal. Jonah rarely spoke. He read the menu like a man reviewing a ranch ledger, then ordered exactly the same as the day before: beef stew, bread, and black coffee, no sugar. But every time she brought the tray, his eyes lifted to meet hers, calm and sharp, as though trying to see through the thin dust of the world to whatever truth still remained. She noticed, after a while, that he always rested his right hand on the table, tapping one finger in a steady rhythm, slow, deliberate, like a man checking whether his heart still beat. That small motion repeated day after day, and strangely, it steadied her. In that quiet rhythm, Nadine felt a kind of certainty she had never known. Jonah didn't smile often, but when she dropped a spoon and murmured an apology, he smiled, a brief, gentle crease that softened the lines around his eyes. No one had ever smiled at Nadine like that. Not with pity, not with want. Just with recognition. 2 weeks passed, and each afternoon he appeared without fail. On the 14th day, he waited until the room was nearly empty. Nadine was gathering dishes when Jonah spoke. "Miss Cross," he said, "sit with me a moment." She hesitated. His voice wasn't commanding, merely certain, and something in his tone left no room for refusal. She sat across from him, cloth still in her hands, as if it might shield her. Jonah leaned forward slightly. "I'll be plain," he said. "I need a wife." The words hit like a dropped plate. Nadine froze, sure she'd misheard. But Jonah didn't look away. "I'm not speaking of love," he went on. "I mean a proper arrangement. I've a large ranch, and half the county's waiting for me to die so they can divide it up. I've no children, no one I can trust." Her heart pounded. "You're saying, marry me?" she asked quietly. He nodded once. "You need a place to belong. I need someone beside me in name, someone who'll keep the land from being taken. I believe we might help each other." The room was silent except for the clock ticking on the wall. Heat rose in her cheeks. She thought of the stories she'd heard. White men marrying black women out of convenience. Women left stranded on the prairie when the promise ran out. "You don't know anything about me," she said softly. "I'm just a waitress. I've got nothing you'd want." Jonah studied her a long moment before answering. "You've got something I haven't seen in years. Truth. You don't pretend when you're afraid. You don't hide when you've made a mistake. I've spent a lifetime among people who lie like they breathe. You," his voice dropped, "you're not beautiful the way people talk about beauty. But you're real. And truth lasts longer than beauty." The words caught in her throat. They weren't flattery. They felt like something steadier, something earned. Her pulse quickened, caught between fear and a strange warmth she didn't know what to do with. "You won't regret it?" she whispered. Jonah tilted his head slightly. "I've regretted trusting the wrong people," he said. "But I've never regretted doing what felt right." Outside, the sunset had bled into red across the street. The light fell across their table, tracing the calluses on her hands and the deep lines on his. Two lives worn thin by wind and time, now meeting in a rare moment of stillness. Nadine drew a slow breath, then nodded. Not because she believed in happiness, but because she sensed this might be the first step towards something larger than fear. Jonah rose, placed a few coins on the table, and said, "Tomorrow I'll send the pastor. No ceremony, no fuss, just two people agreeing." When he left, Nadine stood staring after him, her heart unsteady. She knew she'd crossed a line she couldn't return from. Yet in that same instant, she realized something. No man had ever spoken to her with such respect. That night, Nadine couldn't sleep. She lay awake thinking of the man with the gray eyes and calloused hands, the one who had told her, in a voice both weary and sure, "Truth lasts longer than beauty." And for the first time in her life, she found herself wishing the dawn would come faster. On a June morning, sunlight slipped through the cottonwoods by the creek, scattering across the water like broken mirrors. There was no music, no flowers, only wind, birdsong, and the scent of freshly cut grass. Nadine Cross stood by the bank in a borrowed pale blue dress from a girl in town, the hem just long enough to hide her work-worn feet. Her hair was tied low, a few loose strands brushing her neck, stirring gently in the breeze. Across from her stood Jonah Hale. His white shirt had been pressed flat, his black trousers and polished boots clean as if for a Sunday service. He was not handsome in youth's way, but there was something that held the eye, the calm steadiness of a man who had tasted bitterness and still chosen to stand upright. The preacher's voice rolled low and steady, his words of vow carrying through the air like prayers meant for restless prairie souls. Neither of them spoke of love. They said only "I do," simple words, yet heavy with a courage that felt older than either of them. When it was done, Jonah opened his hand. A small gold ring gleamed against his rough palm, catching the sunlight. Nadine drew in a sharp breath as he slid it onto her finger. It wasn't the weight of gold that made her tremble. It was the meaning. For the first time in her life, someone had placed something in her hand, not out of pity or command, but acknowledgement. The ring was light, yet it carried the weight of all the years she'd been dismissed, the names she'd been called, that colored girl from the hotel. Jonah looked at her, his eyes solemn, grounded as the earth. "You're Nadine Hale now," he said quietly. She stared at her hand. The small band of gold glowed faintly against her dark skin. For the first time, she felt visible. 3 witnesses stood a few steps away, a ranch hand, a kitchen maid, and the preacher. None spoke much. After signing the paper, they left, their footsteps fading across the grass, leaving the two of them alone in a wide, empty field. Jonah turned to her, extending his hand. "Let's go. There's work waiting." Their horses moved along the dirt road, heading toward the Hale Ranch, where white fences glimmered under the sun and low barns hid behind the trees. The ride was quiet. Nadine didn't know what to say or where to look. Each time the wind stirred her skirt and it brushed his leg, her heart quickened. By the time they arrived, the sky had softened into evening. The Hale Ranch spread wide and silent, as if holding its breath. The door stood open. The floors were swept, but the air still carried the faint scent of old lime and damp wood. Jonah walked in first, his voice steady. "You can take the west room. The window faces the fields. If you need anything, tell me." She nodded softly. "Thank you." They shared supper, bread, cured meat, and coffee. They ate in silence, listening to the wind slide along the eaves. Neither spoke of the future. Neither dared mention the past. When night fell, Jonah built a fire in the hearth. The flames flickered against the walls, warm but lonely. Nadine sat in a wooden chair, her fingers curled around her cup, watching him. He wasn't like the men she had known. No touch, no command, no watchful hunger. He simply existed in the space, solid and unthreatening, like a mountain that had seen too much to move. Jonah sat across from her, his hands clasped loosely. "I know this feels strange," he said, "but you're free here. I didn't buy you, Nadine. I only hope you find this a place to begin again." She stared into the fire. "I never thought I'd begin again anywhere." He didn't answer. He only nodded, as though listening to something deeper beneath her words. After a moment, he rose and spoke quietly. "Rest. You're tired." When the door to her room closed, Nadine stayed sitting in the dark, listening to the crackle of fire from the next room. The house felt vast, every sound echoing, a space between two people learning how to exist side by side, somewhere between loneliness and need. Outside the window, moonlight spilled across the fields. Nadine lifted her hand and turned the gold ring in the pale light. It gleamed faintly, proof that even if this marriage hadn't begun with love, it might, just might, teach them how to find their hearts again. The first days of marriage passed like the breath of someone learning how to live again. The house, once hollow and silent, began to breathe with small sounds: the sweep of a broom, the splash of water from the well, the creak of floorboards beneath Nadine's steps. She rose before dawn, when mist still clung to the fields. Her hair tied up, dress pinned to her knees, Nadine cleaned every corner of the home Jonah had left for her to fill. The kitchen windows were thrown open to the morning air. The old panes were scrubbed clear. She placed a few wildflowers in a chipped vase, not for decoration, but as a quiet reminder that life could still be soft, even here among dust and stone. Jonah didn't interfere. He stood back and watched. At his age, he had forgotten what waiting felt like. But each time he caught sight of Nadine moving through the sunlight, lifting her arms to tie her hair, he felt something stir deep in his chest, a steady beat he thought his heart had long abandoned. In the afternoons, Nadine started a vegetable garden behind the house. The soil was dry, cracked, unyielding. She dug into it with all her strength, short, firm strokes of the hoe. Jonah came over and took it gently from her hands. "Let me. This soil knows me better." She looked up, steady. "If you do it, it'll only ever know you. I need to make it learn my hands, too." He paused, then laughed, a quiet, rich sound that startled even him. For the first time, something like equality hung between them. The ranch hands began to look at Nadine differently. She was no longer the stranger from town, but the woman of this place, calm, capable, listening more than she spoke. She learned their names, their habits, how to divide the work. When someone fell sick, she carried medicine to the stables. When Jonah needed papers, she knew exactly which drawer to open. One afternoon, Jonah caught a nail in his hand while mending the fence. Blood welled dark and quick. Nadine rushed to him without a word, took his wrist, and pulled him inside. She washed the wound with salt water, her movements slow, precise. When her fingers brushed his skin, Jonah forgot to breathe. Her hands were small, cool, strong, A few loose strands of her hair framed her face. The scent of soap lingered between them. "Does it hurt?" she asked, eyes still focused on his hand. "Not as much as it used to." "Used to?" He was silent for a moment. "When I thought no one could touch me without obligation." She looked up. Their eyes met in the dim light from the window. Nothing grand passed between them, just a glance, but in that quiet moment, among the smells of blood, wood, and earth, something human and warm began to rise. On another day, Jonah taught her to ride. Nadine had never been on a horse. Her hands gripped the reins stiffly. "Don't be afraid," he said, standing close behind her. She drew a breath. The scent of leather and his nearness mixed in the air. As the horse began to move, she leaned back instinctively, her shoulder brushing his chest. A fleeting touch that made them both hold still. "Good," Jonah murmured. "Listen to its steps. Once you feel its rhythm, it'll listen to you." Nadine laughed softly, the kind of laugh that belonged only to her, light as the first rain on dry ground. It was the first time Jonah had seen her truly smile. No reserve, no caution, just simple, pure joy. That evening, they shared supper without the old stiffness. Nadine spoke of small-town happenings. Jonah mostly listened, nodding now and then, the corners of his eyes easing as she spoke. Later, Nadine stood on the porch, watching stars scatter across the sky. The air carried the scent of cut grass and cool earth. Behind her, Jonah stepped outside, stopping at the doorway. He didn't touch her. He only stood there, hands clasped, his voice quiet. "You've made this house less silent." She turned, smiling gently. "It just needed someone to talk to it." He smiled back, a small, fragile thing, almost lost to the wind. When she turned away, moonlight fell across her shoulders, soft as a promise yet to be spoken. And inside that old house, once filled only with wind and memories, two heartbeats began to find the same rhythm. Slow, unadorned, but real. Summer came slow and heavy. By day, the wind blew dry across the fields, carrying the scent of scorched grass even into the house. By night, the air stilled. Only crickets filled the silence while the warmth of the earth rose through the floorboards. In that stillness, Nadine could hear her own heartbeat. They had lived together long enough to know each other's rhythms. The creak of his boots on the porch, the click of her door latch, the quiet habits that filled their days. Jonah drank coffee at dawn and read the ranch ledgers at dusk. Nadine, after he left the table, would quietly clean his cup, polish the wood where his hand had rested. Between them lingered a fragile distance, not born of strangeness, but of fear. Fear that naming what was growing between them might break it. That night, the air refused to move. The house felt thick with their shared breath. Nadine sat by the cracked window, sweat glinting at her collarbone. Outside, the moon hung low and gold, glowing like a dying ember. Jonah stepped in, his shirt unbuttoned at the throat, dust still on his sleeves. He paused, eyes steady, searching. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. "Too hot," she murmured. "The air's gone still." He reached for the wooden fan on the table and waved it gently. The faint breeze stirred her hair, too weak to cool her, but enough to make her breath hitch. Silence returned. One of them exhaled. The sound vanished into the night. Nadine kept her eyes on the window. Her voice came low, thoughtful. Do you ever get scared, Jonah? Scared of what? Of living your whole life without ever being truly loved. He was quiet for a long time. Then he set the fan down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I'm scared, he said. But not of never being loved. I'm scared I'll die without ever knowing how to love right. She looked up. Moonlight spilled through the window, lighting half his face. Tired, honest, and achingly human. In that soft light, Nadine saw not the landowner, not the man people whispered about, but someone learning to trust again. He reached out, hesitating as if afraid she'd pull away, but she didn't. His fingers brushed her wrist, warm, rough. The air shifted, thickened. Jonah stood slowly, taking a few steps closer. Nadine could hear the sound of his breathing, the faint scent of sweat, smoke, and leather that had become familiar. When his hand rose to her cheek, she closed her eyes. No words followed. The first kiss came uncertain, slow, like they were finding their way through darkness. Jonah kissed her not as a man claiming, but as one praying, gentle, cautious, and real. She answered, trembling, caught between fear and belief. They touched again, longer this time. Shirts slid from shoulders, breath mingled in the warm air. There was no hunger, no rush, only two weary souls remembering how to feel alive, how to be seen. Jonah's hand traced down her back, slow and steady, as though he were drawing faith into the shape of her spine. Nadine pressed her palm against his chest, felt the strong pulse beneath sun-browned skin. Your heart, she whispered, her breath unsteady. Is it all right? He gave a low laugh, rough as the wind outside. It is now. It remembers who it's beating for. They lay still for a long time, listening to the night, the crickets, the quiet rhythm of shared breath. Sweat dampened the sheets. The smell of skin mixed with the scent of dry soil. There was no savior, no saved. Only two people finding each other again through the ruins of old pain. When the heat began to fade, Nadine rested her head against his chest. Moonlight slanted through the curtain, painting her face in pale gold, serene, tender, like a quiet hymn. Jonah ran a hand through her damp hair and whispered, "Sleep, Nadine." She listened to his heartbeat, steady, grounded, the same rhythm as the land beneath them. And before sleep took her, she knew what had come alive between them wasn't duty nor miracle. It was love itself, born silent and real, in the night's heat and the sound of their shared breath. That autumn came softly, as if the land itself were holding its breath for the small house at the edge of the fields. Mornings were pale and silver, mist curling along the fences. Nadine stood by the window, one hand resting gently over her belly, where life was quietly growing, calm and certain. She was 4 months along. The news brought a pulse of warmth through the ranch. Jonah rose earlier, came home on time, and sometimes brought her wildflowers or a crust of bread from town. He never said much, but the faint smile that had returned to his worn face was enough for everyone to notice. At night, they sat together on the porch, Nadine's head resting on his shoulder, listening to the crickets hum. Once she said, "I wonder who the child will take after." Jonah laid his hand over her belly. "God willing, it'll have your heart and my head. And if it's the other way around, that's fine too, so long as it learns kindness." They both laughed, soft, easy laughter, the kind that came from people who had once thought their lives were over, and had now found a reason to begin again. But peace never lasts long in Wyoming. Shadows began to stretch from the roads Jonah had long avoided, his own family. One morning after Jonah left to meet a horse buyer in Cheyenne, a black carriage rolled up to the gate. Nadine saw it from the window, her heart tightening. From it stepped Loretta Hale, Jonah's stepmother, draped in black velvet with a lace collar white as frost. Her face was carved sharp, like a statue from a church. Beside her stood Jasper, Jonah's half-brother, nearly 20 years younger, smirking as though the world itself were a private joke. Loretta's eyes swept the house, pausing on the gold band around Nadine's finger. "I see Jonah still has a habit of pitying the lowly," she said, her voice edged with scorn. Nadine straightened her back. "He didn't pity me," she said quietly. "He chose me." Jasper laughed, the sound thin and cruel. "Chose a colored servant for a wife? Do you know what they call you in town? A stain on the Hale name." Nadine didn't answer. She only watched as the wind stirred the dust behind them. When they turned to leave, she heard Loretta whisper to her son, "When he's gone, it all returns to us, Jasper. Don't forget that." Jonah came home that evening quieter than usual. He sat long before the hearth, turning a glass of whiskey in his hand, without drinking. "They came, didn't they?" "Yes," Nadine said. "Don't let them frighten you," he murmured. "You've nothing to prove. Just live." She saw the weight in his eyes, more than weariness, almost a premonition. But Jonah was not a man to run from trouble. The next day, a letter arrived from Cheyenne. A contract to sell his best stock, a deal that could save the ranch from debt. Before he left, he bent to kiss her forehead. "I'll be back before the full moon," he said. "You and the baby stay strong." She smiled faintly and squeezed his hand. "Go on. I'll be here." 3 days later, the first storm of the season struck. Wind battered the roof, thunder rolled across the plains. Near midnight, Nadine heard hooves in the distance, then pounding on the door. A ranch hand burst in, soaked through, his face ashen. "Mrs. Hale, there's been an accident. His wagon went off the ridge near Stone Ridge Pass. No one made it out." Nadine stood frozen. The world seemed to stop. She heard only the heavy drum of rain on the roof, steady, merciless like a broken heartbeat. She didn't cry. She simply clenched the handkerchief in her fist until her nails bit into her skin. By morning, the news had spread across the valley. Jonah Hale was dead. Loretta arrived with a lawyer, carrying an old will Jonah had never updated. His estate would temporarily fall to her and Jasper until the new wife proves her marriage valid. They gave her no time for mourning. The house was stripped, the granary locked, the loyal workers dismissed. Nadine stood in the hollow quiet of the home they had built, staring at the land that had once promised them a future. The wind tore through the open door, lifting the curtains. She laid a hand over her belly, willing herself to feel the faint stir within. But everything was still. Even the sky seemed to hold its breath. She whispered, her voice trembling like the wind itself. "You said you'd be back before the full moon." "The moon's rising now, Jonah. I'm still waiting." And as the sunset bled red across the horizon, Nadine Hale understood that everything she had trusted was gone, except for the small promise growing inside her, and the vast, aching emptiness of the Wyoming sky. After the hurried funeral, without a body, the Hale ranch house felt like a stranger's dwelling. Rooms once filled with light were locked and shuttered, and the footsteps of unfamiliar men echoed across the floors like nails sealing the coffin of a past life. Nadine Hale, once called the new mistress, was now forced to live in the small servants' quarters beneath the kitchen, the same damp room that had once housed the help. Since the day Jonah was declared dead, Loretta Hale and her son Jasper had taken full control. Wages were cut, loyal workers dismissed, and Nadine, pregnant and alone, was ordered to scrub floors, cook, and serve meals like any other maid. Loretta watched her with eyes that glittered between contempt and satisfaction. "You see now," she said coolly, "blood runs stronger than color. You never belonged here." Rumors spread faster than the Wyoming wind. In town, whispers turned cruel, that Nadine had poisoned her husband to steal his land, that God had punished her with a bastard child. When she went to buy flour and salt, women turned their backs. Shopkeepers avoided her gaze. A child pointed and giggled, "That's the colored woman who killed Mr. Hale." Every whisper cut like a small, invisible blade. Nadine said nothing. She carried her parcels home in silence, her shoes heavy with dust, her eyes dry though her chest ached to break. At night, she returned to the damp room below the kitchen. The stone floor was cold. The air smelled of soot and mold. She coughed until her throat burned. Sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, she laid a trembling hand over her belly, feeling the faint stir of life within, the only proof she still had a purpose. "You must live," she whispered. "I'll live for you." But cruelty was not done with her yet. One gray afternoon, searching the cellar for potatoes, Nadine's foot slipped on the narrow steps. The wood was slick, the air close. Her belly was heavy now, her balance uncertain. She fell hard, tumbling down, hitting her back on the floor. The breath left her in a choked cry. Pain seized her middle, fierce and unrelenting. Blood spread dark across her skirt. For a long moment she couldn't move. The storm outside drowned every sound. No one heard her fall. She lay there, clutching her stomach, cold seeping up her spine. "Please," she thought, "not the baby." Her vision blurred, and in the haze she saw Jonah, riding across the fields, smiling faintly, eyes steady as earth. His voice came to her not through ears, but through the aching space inside her chest. "Don't let anyone take what's yours." With a groan, she dragged herself up, gripping the wall, inch by inch. Every movement felt like glass cutting through her muscles. Sweat chilled her skin. "No," she whispered through her teeth. "He's not dead. I won't believe it." The pain came in waves, but somehow it passed. The child stilled, quiet but alive. When it was over, Nadine collapsed, her forehead pressed against the dirt floor. Tears slid from her eyes, mixing with dust. Thunder rolled across the plains outside, shaking the window panes. It was Martha, the old housekeeper Jonah had hired years ago, who found her hours later. Nadine lay unconscious, still cradling her stomach as if shielding the child from unseen hands. Martha called for help, and they carried Nadine to her bed, covered her with blankets, lit the fire, and waited. That night, beneath the wavering light of the hearth, Nadine awoke. Her body ached, sweat clung to her skin, but she was breathing. She watched the flames dance and reached again for her belly. A soft kick answered her touch. A single tear fell, landing on the rough skin of her hand. She looked up toward the low ceiling and whispered into the stillness, If he's alive, I won't break. Outside, the wind rose again, sweeping across the fields, carrying the soft patter of rain. And somewhere, beyond the ridge, beyond the storm, there was the faint sound of a lone horse moving through the dark, returning to her, slow, steady, like a promise never forgotten. The first morning of October broke dim and restless. The sun had barely cleared the ridge when dust rose on the long road leading to the Hale ranch, swirling like a storm coming alive. Hoofbeats thundered, heavy, relentless, rolling over the plains like far-off thunder. The ranch hands stepped out, squinting toward the horizon, just in time to see a lone rider tearing through the gate, lean and covered in dirt, eyes burning like coals. Jonah Hale had returned. For a moment, no one recognized him. He was thinner, his skin burned dark by sun and wind, his clothes torn, his face hollow. But when he dismounted, standing tall despite the weight of miles and months, the air itself seemed to still. Nadine was at the well, drawing water for the kitchen. She lifted her head and froze. That figure, those eyes, it couldn't be anyone else. The bucket slipped from her hand and crashed into the dirt, water splashing at her feet. Jonah moved toward her. Each step raised a small cloud of dust, and she stood motionless, afraid that if she blinked, he would vanish like a dream. But when he stopped before her, his eyes were fierce and full of pain. God, Nadine. His voice was rough, cracked like dry earth. What have they done to you? She couldn't speak. Only tears came, falling silently, streaking through the dust on her cheeks. Jonah pulled her into his arms. The embrace was hard, trembling, filled with the ache of too many lost nights, of fevered dreams where he had called her name into the dark and found no answer. They said you were dead, she whispered against his chest. I know, Jonah said, his tone low and cold as the wind before a storm. But they'll regret letting me live. She pressed her face against him, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart, real, solid, alive. His hand came to rest over her belly, where the child had begun to grow. Their eyes met, wet and wordless. I swore, Jonah murmured, no one would ever lay a hand on you or our child again. They went inside. The kitchen was cold, the hearth long dead. Nadine rekindled the fire. Smoke curled upward, stinging both their eyes. Jonah sat at the table in silence, his gaze sweeping the room that had once been the heart of their home. His photograph was gone. His chair, the one he'd built himself, missing. The house bore the marks of strangers. Tell me everything, he said quietly. And she did. She spoke of Loretta and the lawyer, of how they had stripped the house bare, turned her into a servant, spread their lies, and left her to fend for herself. She told him about the fall, the blood, the nights she thought she'd lost the child. Her voice trembled, sometimes steady, sometimes breaking, her fingers clutching the torn fabric of her dress. Jonah listened without a word. But on the table, his hands tightened, veins standing out against the skin, knuckles whitening with the effort to stay still when she finished. Only the faint crackle of burning wood filled the room. Jonah rose slowly. His shadow stretched across the wall, long and dark. They stole my home, he said, voice even and low. They hurt you. They dragged my name through filth, and they nearly killed our child. He turned to her. The man who faced her was not the one who had left months ago, broken and weary. Something fierce had awakened behind his eyes, something that had survived death itself. "We'll take it all back," he said. Nadine didn't move. She saw in his face something both frightening and beautiful. The spark of life returned, quiet and unstoppable. Outside, the wind rose again, sweeping across the plains, sending dust spinning toward the horizon. Jonah stepped closer, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Rest now, Nadine. Eat something, then sleep. I've got business with the devils wearing my family's name." He walked out to the porch, standing beneath the harsh white sun. The dust swirled around his boots, catching the light, framing him in a strange, solemn glow. And Nadine, watching from the doorway, knew the real storm had only just begun. Morning light slipped through the dust-coated windows of the Hale parlor, catching on motes that turned slowly in the still air. Once a room of pride and power, it now felt like a courtroom waiting for judgment. Jonah Hale stood in the center, a cane steadying his weight, his frame thin but unbroken. The lines on his face had deepened into something almost carved. His eyes, clear, cold, and unwavering, were the eyes of a man who had walked through fire and come out tempered, not burned. Loretta Hale entered first, dressed in black, collar high, every movement rehearsed in old habits of control. Behind her, Jasper followed, small and soft in his fine coat, his gaze darting like a rat caught in sunlight. Jonah didn't offer a seat. He didn't need to. The silence in the room was its own authority. For days after his return, he had gone through every ledger, every letter, every folded scrap of paper hidden in drawers. Numbers told the story better than words. $300 withdrawn from the Laramie Bank days before his accident, transferred to a hired driver out of Denver, the same man who had cut the wagon's brakes and disappeared. No confession, no witness. But Jonah knew. Out here, guilt had a smell, and it hung in the air like iron and dust. Now, he faced the two who carried his name but had long since emptied it of meaning. Loretta wouldn't meet his eyes. Jasper tried to smile, the same slick, half-crooked grin that had once fooled investors and family alike, but sweat already gathered along his temples. Jonah's silence pressed down heavier than any accusation. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it struck like a hammer. He didn't shout, didn't curse. He simply recounted, fact by fact, wound by wound. The rain on Stone Ridge, the overturned wagon, the nameless hands that had pulled him from the wreck, the weeks of fever in a stranger's barn while he whispered Nadine's name to the dark, then the records, the $300, Jasper's signature, the trail that led back to this house. Loretta's fingers trembled against her skirt. She understood then that her defenses, status, lineage, the cruel calm of authority, were nothing before the truth her own son had sold. She had raised him to value cunning over conscience, power over compassion. And now, here was the cost. The one son she'd despised had survived her schemes, and the one she'd protected stood revealed as a coward. Jasper said nothing. His head hung low, eyes fixed on the gleam of his shoes. Jonah turned to the butler, who had served the family since before any of them had names worth remembering, and asked for the satchel he'd prepared. Inside was a small sum of money and a letter, an agreement giving Jasper a modest share, enough to leave Wyoming and never come back. Jonah placed it on the table. No threats, no raised hand. Only the heavy pause of a man who had measured justice not in rage, but in the quiet certainty of what must be done. Loretta finally rose. Her back remained straight, her face composed, but her shadow on the wall had shortened, as if power itself had slipped from her shoulders. When she left, the click of her heels faded into silence that felt almost holy. Jonah sank slowly into his chair by the window. Sunlight touched half his face, revealing the map of years that had weathered him. The parlor around him seemed smaller now, familiar, but stripped of illusion. The portrait of his father hung crooked, the rug Nadine once cleaned threadbare at the edges. For the first time he saw the house not as inheritance, but as burden. Blood and reputation had built its walls. Only truth and love could make it a home again. The door opened softly. Nadine stepped in. She wore a simple dark dress, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. The light from the porch caught her skin, warm and golden, and something in Jonah's chest eased. Without a word, he rose. He met her halfway, taking her hand, those same hands that had worked, healed, and held him when the world had forgotten. Around them, the house staff and a few lingering onlookers stood in silence. Jonah turned, his voice low but steady enough to carry through every corner of the room. "This is Mrs. Hale." It wasn't a declaration. It was a restoration, a truth placed back where it belonged. Outside, wind swept across the open fields, carrying the scent of hay and milk, of work and mourning. Inside, the fire in the hearth flared suddenly, casting warmth into the cold room, proof that justice, however late, could still set a heart beating again. Winter settled thick and slow across the hills surrounding the Hale ranch. A white hush laid over the fields like the breath of something ancient. The wind carried the scent of cold soil and the quiet promise of birth. Inside the big house, fires burned around the clock, and everyone moved softly, waiting. The time was near. The child of Jonah and Nadine Hale, the first seed of life sown after so much loss and redemption. That night, the Wyoming sky was a vault of cloud, moonless, lit only by the flicker of a single lamp through the window. Nadine's pains began near midnight. She didn't cry out, just gripped the bedsheet, her knuckles pale against the fabric, sweat beading on her brow. The midwife from town came with hot water and murmured prayers, while Jonah sat beside her, his hand wrapped tightly around hers, as if to keep her from slipping away again into some place he could not follow. Each contraction came like a wave breaking against rock, merciless, inevitable. The room thickened with heat and breath. Jonah said little. He wiped her face with a damp cloth, his voice low, steady, tender as wind through grass. "You're stronger than this whole land put together," he whispered. Nadine didn't answer. She looked at him through tears, and in that gaze he saw something he'd never witnessed before, the raw light of creation itself, something ancient, vast, and unstoppable. When the first cry pierced the air, it felt as though the entire house had exhaled. A girl, skin the color of warm earth, curls damp against her forehead, eyes dark and deep as soil after rain. The midwife placed her in Nadine's arms. Nadine held her close, trembling, while Jonah sat frozen, watching in silence, his hands clasped so tightly they tremored. When words finally came, they were a whisper. "She'll be called Grace." Grace, the word itself a benediction, a small forgiveness offered by the heavens after years of drought. From that day on, the ranch changed. Grass greened early. The horses fattened after the long freeze. Old workers, hearing Jonah was alive, came back one by one, bringing loyalty and laughter in their wake. Nadine's laughter joined theirs, light and sure, mingling with the soft babble of the child who had given them back the sound of life. Jonah mended the west fence and rebuilt the stables. His hands, once tremoring from illness, grew steady again. He said the land didn't belong to any man, only to those who kept it with love. Nadine answered, smiling, "Then we belong to it." Each evening she carried Grace to the well, the baby bundled against her shoulder as she hummed softly, watching the fields in the golden light. The woman who had once been a servant in this place no longer hid her face. The wind that had once whispered her name in pity now seemed to carry it in respect. When spring came, Jonah took her to town. They stopped before an old red brick building, the Maverick Hotel where they had first met. The sign hung crooked, windows broken, the air heavy with dust and memory. Jonah said quietly that he'd bought it. "We'll fix it up," he told her. "Not for us alone, but for those like you, the ones who were never given a place to stand." That summer, Nadine poured every ounce of herself into the work. She gathered widows, out-of-work cowhands, and the few townsfolk willing to help. They scraped the walls, painted the shutters, stitched new curtains by lantern light. Each board they nailed into place felt like another piece of her past, redeemed. When they finished, the building rose proud and new in the setting sun, a silent declaration that dignity could be rebuilt from ashes. On the fresh white sign above the door, Jonah had carved her words. "The Hale boarding house for travelers, for workers, for the weary." At the opening, the townspeople came, some curious, some contrite, a few who had once turned their backs. Nadine welcomed them all, Grace in her arms, her smile calm and open. Jonah stood beside her, watching the woman and child who had taught him that happiness was never owned. It was tended, like land after a storm. As evening fell, the last light glowed against the red brick walls. Nadine looked up at him and said softly, "We began here, and now everything begins again, in this same place." Jonah nodded, eyes drawn to the sign above them, to the woman whose strength had rebuilt not just walls, but the very meaning of the Hale name. Once buried in the dark, she now stood in full light, and that light, steady and golden, would guide all the days still left to come. Time flowed like a quiet river cutting through the golden and frozen seasons alike. Across the 40,000 acres of land, peace finally took root. When Grace turned 6, the old illness in Jonah Hale's heart returned for the last time. It came softly, stealing him away in his sleep as the first light of dawn touched the window of his room. That morning, Nadine sat beside his bed, Grace's small hand curled in hers. She watched the face of the man who had weathered storms and betrayal, and yet carried gentleness to the very end. His hair had turned white, his breath gone still, but the faint trace of a smile lingered, serene, almost tender, as if saying farewell to the world he had finally made right. There were no violent tears, only a deep, sacred stillness between two hearts that understood love doesn't end. It only changes its form. After the burial, Nadine stood alone in the field behind the house. Spring wind swept across the grass, stirring her dark dress and carrying the scent of new earth and birds returning. The Wyoming sky stretched wide and endless, just as it always had. Only the man who once said, "This land belongs to those who love it," had now become a part of it. Life on the Hale ranch did not fall silent. Under Nadine's steady hands, it grew stronger. She ran the estate with quiet discipline, teaching Grace how to read land maps, how to tell rain from the scent of wind, and how to sense when the horses were restless before a storm. People in town began calling her the strangest woman in Wyoming, the black widow of a white landowner who neither remarried nor accepted help from suitors eager to look after her and the child. Well-dressed men came from Cheyenne, bringing flowers, wine, and soft promises. Nadine smiled politely, thanked them, and closed the gate. At night, after Grace had fallen asleep, Nadine sat on the porch where Jonah once drank his morning coffee. The old wooden chair still creaked when the wind passed through, sounding almost like his sigh. She spoke to him then, about the harvest, about their daughter, about the new workers who had come seeking a fair wage. She spoke as if he could still hear her. And perhaps he did, in the rustle of the fields, in the rhythm of hoofbeats crossing the yard. Grace grew up between her father's soil and her mother's strength. Her eyes shone with the same clarity Jonah once had, her laughter light and unafraid. Nadine saw in her both memory and future. She taught her that kindness was the only strength that never runs dry, that a person could lose their house, their money, even their name, but never their dignity. In town, the Hale boarding house remained open for travelers and the weary. Moss crept up the brick walls, but the small sign by the door still caught the light each evening. People spoke of Jonah and Nadine's story like a local legend, a white man and a black woman who had defied the world's cruelty and built a legacy not of wealth, but of compassion and courage. Every spring, Nadine and Grace brought flowers to Jonah's grave. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the wind move across the plains. The stone bore only a few words. Jonah Hale, a man of the land, loved by its light. Years passed. Silver crept into Nadine's hair, but the light at the ranch never dimmed. From town, travelers could still see the small lamp glowing on her porch each night. Some swore they heard a faint laugh drifting on the wind. Jonah's voice mingled with hers, warm and unbroken, like the breath of the land itself. Their story became a part of Wyoming's quiet gospel, not of conquest, but of endurance, not of wealth, but of love that had learned to outlast loss. The years of light were not what came after his death. They were the years they had shared in truth and grace, when two souls had learned that to love deeply is to live twice, once in the moment and once in its echo. And if this story brings you a smile or a tear, leave a thought below. Like, subscribe, and share these tales so that stories of compassion, forgiveness, and love that transcends time, like Wild West love stories, may continue to travel far and find their way to hearts that still believe. Because sometimes one beautiful story is enough to warm an entire afternoon of someone's life.